it's Matt, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the music I listen to. Now, some of you may remember I did a video about music a few years ago. More specifically, I went through the list of artists on my iPod and made some commentary on some of them. But today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I am going to be shuffling my music library on my iPhone and making commentary about the songs or artists that come up. So you're not going to see everything I listen to, but this may be a little more interesting because it is random. So I do hope you enjoy it. And here we go. We're going to start with this song I have right here, which is Dandelion by Boards of Canada, off the album Geogati. And Boards of Canada, if you're not familiar with them, are, in my opinion, a really great electronic music group. They're kind of, the music varies a little, but I generally call them ambient electronic. They sound almost moody or nostalgic at times. They're very good at evoking feelings from me in very odd or unexpected ways. Now, I don't remember exactly what this specific song sounds like, but Geogati is probably the most sinister sounding of their albums. In some ways, people have almost described it as satanic, but I wouldn't say that. It just kind of has this uneasy feeling to it, if that makes any sense. It's not quite as relaxing as their other stuff, but I would recommend it. It is probably one of my favorites of theirs. And yeah, if that sounds like something that's up your alley, you may enjoy the album Geogati, or more broadly, Boards of Canada. Now let's see what's next. We have Vitamin by Incubus, off the album Science, or S-C-I-E-N-C-E. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this is Incubus's first full-length album. If not, it is one of their earlier ones. But Incubus is a band I've liked for a long time. I listened to them a lot more when I was a teenager, but I have seen them twice in concert. And they're just an all-around very enjoyable band. They're not particularly amazing in any area, but they do a good job, they put on a good show, and the music is, I guess, enjoyable is the best word for it. If you're not familiar with them, they are alternative rock, but may have some different elements to their music at times. Some more kind of record scratching, DJ elements, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but almost in a way kind of like a lighter version of Linkin Park at times. That probably sounds ridiculous, but that's the first thing that came to mind. So, there we have it. And next up is Abe the Cop by the Dillinger Escape Plan from the album Under the Running Board. And the Dillinger Escape Plan is, or was before they broke up, one of my favorite bands of all time. They are not necessarily accessible. Their music is very loud and chaotic and unpredictable, and even people who like metal may find them a bit extreme at times, but they are unlike any other band, in my opinion, at least from the bands I'm familiar with. And I do believe they have influenced many other bands over the years, especially in the metal scene. So, Under the Running Board is their EP, one of their first EPs. which ones you count. It's the first EP that's easy to get. They did have an earlier one, if I'm not mistaken, just called the Dillinger Escape Plan, but their earlier stuff is probably my least favorite. But that said, I love pretty much all their stuff. So if you're not familiar with the Dillinger Escape Plan and you are open-minded and willing to try some kind of extreme metal, you may enjoy them. And next up is the song Religious Vomit by Dead Kennedys from the album Plastic Surgery Disasters / In God We Trust Incorporated. Now, if you're not familiar with Dead Kennedys, they are a very influential, one of the earlier hardcore punk bands. And while I like them a lot, I actually hadn't listened to them much until recent months. I knew the song Holiday in Cambodia primarily from playing it on an old Guitar Hero game, but now that I've listened to more of their stuff, I can see how influential they were, and they just have an energy to them that I really enjoy, kind of a very rebellious energy, more so than many other punk rock bands I listen to. So if you like punk rock and somehow you're not familiar with Dead Kennedys, I would highly recommend them. Next is Never Enough by Maylene and the Sons of Disaster from their album 4. And Maylene and the Sons of Disaster are a band that I've not found anything quite like since I found them. They're kind of somewhere in between hard rock and metal most of the time, but with a very heavy southern edge to them. Things like banjos and kind of a southern style of singing. It's like in between a scream and a sing, but you can just feel the southernness of it, if that makes any sense. And though this is not one of my favorite songs of theirs, I generally enjoy most of their discography. And like I keep saying, if it sounds like something you might like, I would highly recommend Maylene and the Sons of Disaster. Unfortunately, I'm not sure they're making music anymore because their lead singer got into a tragic accident, but thankfully I believe he is still alive, just not able to be in the band anymore, so they haven't really made much since this album. Unfortunate, but I'm glad they were able to make what they made. And next up is the circus that has brought us back to these nights. Yo. Chocola. I had forgotten the full name of that song, but The Fall of Troy is a band I listened to a fair bit of in college. They are, I'm not entirely sure what category I would categorize them as, what genre I would categorize them as. But if you like heavy music, especially very guitar heavy, very kind of noodling on the guitar, lots of notes. I don't know how to describe it very well. I'm doing a terrible job of it, but you get the idea. If you like that kind of thing, you may like The Fall of Troy. And next up, it is Buffalo 666 by Every Time I Die, a bonus track from New Junk Aesthetic. Every Time I Die is, I'm not sure what the genre is. I'm not great at pinpointing very specific subgenres of heavy music, so I'm going to call them hardcore. I hope that's right. But this song specifically, I don't remember very well, but I generally enjoy pretty much everything by Every Time I Die, even if they're not one of my favorite bands. I usually leave them on when they come on shuffle. And if you like heavy music, I would recommend them. They're quite enjoyable. Next up is Strobe Light, featuring Pevin Everett by Gorillaz, off the album this is one of the most recent Gorillaz albums, and it is pretty good. It's not one of my favorites, though. My favorite Gorillaz album is definitely Demon Days. In fact, that is one of my favorite albums of all time. I listened to it quite a bit in high school, and it's just an all-around fantastic album. But aside from that, I do think Gorillaz is an important band. They have so many different genres throughout their music, often very hip-hop and pop tinged, but they branch out into different styles enough that there's always something interesting around the corner when you're listening to their albums. And if you're not familiar with Gorillaz, and any of that sounds interesting to you, I would recommend it, or recommend them. And next up is Room 429 by Strapping Young Lad, off the album City. Now, Strapping Young Lad, if any of you are familiar with Devin Townsend, or the Devin Townsend Project, this is one of his earlier projects, Strapping Young Lad, and it is, if I'm not mistaken, by far the heaviest stuff he has done. But if you're not familiar with Devin Townsend, I would recommend checking out his music, regardless of what genres you're into, because he does have a fairly wide range of styles. He generally leans towards heavier music and more kind of grand, epic sounding productions. But there's some very relaxing ambient stuff like on the album Ghost, and a good variety of material that you might enjoy. And I believe he's coming out this month with an album called Empath that he seems very excited to be putting out, and from the one song I've heard so far, it seems like he is putting a lot of effort into it, and so I'm quite excited to see that. But yes, this is Room 429 by Strapping Young Lad, off a very, very, very heavy album. And next up is Die Slow by Health, off the album Get Color. Now, Health is a very interesting band to me. They're kind of, I'd say, noise rock. There's a bit of an industrial element to them, but it's mostly kind of harder, more alternative indie-ish rock with noise elements to it, kind of harsh grating sound effects and other things used creatively. And to be honest, I haven't listened to a ton of Health aside from the album Death Magic, which is easily my favorite of theirs, but in general I do like Health quite a bit. This album, if I remember correctly, is maybe not quite as accessible as Death Magic, so if you're interested in checking them out, I would recommend that album, but this is pretty good as well. Next up is Top Yourself by the Raconteurs, off the album Consolers of the Lonely. And I thought this was a great album. I haven't listened to it in quite some time, but I'd say I think around my high school years. I was very much into the White Stripes and other things that Jack White had been working on, and the Raconteurs was one of them. Their first album was pretty good, but this album, Consolers of the Lonely, I really, really enjoyed, especially the production value of it. It just sounds really well recorded and mastered. It's not groundbreaking music by any measure, but if you're into alternative rock, I would recommend it. And next is Kawaii by Devin Townsend Project. And I was just talking about Devin Townsend Project, so this is a fun coincidence, but this song is off the album Ghost, and it is quite chill. I would recommend the album Ghost if you are interested in chill, relaxing, feel-good music. I can't really say much else to describe it right now, though, so that's really all I have to say. A great album, though. Next up is Stoner Hate by Darren Malakian and Scars on Broadway, off the album Scars on Broadway. Now, when this album came out, it was just Scars on Broadway, the artist was. But since releasing a newer album, they added the lead singer and guitarist name. And if you're not familiar with that name, he is one of the guitarists and the singers in System of a Down. This is his side project, and you can definitely hear the influence if you're familiar with System of a Down. The guitar style is quite similar, and I'd say in general, if you like System of a Down and you haven't listened to any of Scars on Broadway, I would recommend them, but I don't think they're quite as good as System of a Down. And yeah, that's all I really have to say about them. If you're familiar with System of a Down, you kind of know what to expect here. And next up is Dimension by Wolfmother. So Wolfmother is a band I remember liking quite a bit in high school. Haven't really listened to them much since then, but I remember them being quite often criticized for sounding a lot like a ripoff of Led Zeppelin. And while I can understand those criticisms, and they're not the most original or mind-blowing band around, I thought this was pretty good, feel-good rock. And if you're in the mood for that kind of thing, I would recommend Wolfmother. Just don't expect anything to blow your mind. That's all I gotta say about that. And now we have I'll Show You by Vaughn Rea. This is another band that I haven't really listened to much of. I listened to them a little bit in high school. They were recommended to me by a friend, but they are pretty straightforward, generic, alternative rock, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But if you're in the mood for it, you might like it. Wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it specifically, though. And now we have The Chain by Fleetwood Mac off the album Rumors. This is one of my favorite Fleetwood Mac songs. I haven't listened to a ton of Fleetwood Mac, though. I really should, because I've liked pretty much everything I've heard from them. But Fleetwood Mac, if you're not familiar with them, are just one of those classic bands, and even if you're not familiar with them, you have probably heard some of their stuff, so I would go check them out and see if you recognize anything. And now we have Hold Light by Every Time I Die from the album From Parts Unknown. I don't really have any specific thoughts about this song. I'm not super familiar off the top of my head with everything on this album, so like the last time Every Time I Die came up, I would recommend them if you're into heavy music. But that's about all I have to say right now. Next up is Somewhat Damaged by 9 Inch Nails off the album The Fragile. This is one of my favorite 9 Inch Nails albums, and I'd say that 9 Inch Nails is probably one of my favorite bands of all time. I don't listen to them constantly, but when I'm in the mood, I really enjoy them. And I saw them live once, and I would say it was one of the most impressive live shows I've ever seen. I am assuming, though, that most of you are familiar, at least somewhat, with 9 Inch Nails, so I don't really need to describe them. One of the pioneers, well, maybe not pioneers, but one of the most influential bands in industrial music. Maybe you could call them pioneers. I'm not sure. Depends on your definition. And next up is Spectre Light by Mastodon off The Hunter. Now, Mastodon is another one of my favorite bands of all time. They're not like in the top end of my list of favorite bands, but I consistently enjoy them. They are, I'd say, kind of a sludge metal band at times. They have some variation to their style. They're sometimes prog metal and other various subgenres, but if you like metal and you haven't listened to Mastodon, I would highly recommend their music. That said, The Hunter is probably my least favorite of their albums, or maybe not, of their more recent albums. Some of their earlier stuff I don't know quite as well, but overall, it's very rare that I don't like something by Mastodon. So there you go. Spectre Light by Mastodon. And next is Sappers Tree by Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wallfish off the Blade Runner 2049 soundtrack. I do listen to the occasional movie soundtrack, and I'd say that last year, or no, it was 2017, wasn't it? Yeah, 2017, Blade Runner 2049 was one of my favorite movies of that year, if not my favorite movie, and the soundtrack was a major part of that. This is a fantastic soundtrack, and while I don't recall exactly what this song sounds like, there are some really great tracks on that. So if you're into kind of epic, powerful, grand orchestral scores with a kind of electronic element to them, you may enjoy the Blade Runner 2049 soundtrack, even if you haven't seen the movie. And next up, we have 4 Degrees by Tool off the album Undertow. Those of you who have been around long enough and seen my 10,000 Days Whisper Singing video can probably guess that I like Tool quite a bit. I haven't listened to them quite as much in recent years, especially as they haven't come out with an album in over a decade, but I am looking forward to the album that they have said will eventually come out. Whether that comes out this year or 10 years from now, I'm sure I will listen to it. But if you're not familiar with Tool, they're, I'd say, progressive rock, sometimes veering into progressive metal territory. Very interesting, sometimes long and sprawling songs that go in very, I don't know if I'd say trance-like directions at times, but they are very good at what they do. So that is Tool. Next up is Storm in a Teacup by Red Hot Chili Peppers off the album Stadium Arcadium. I don't remember this song very well. I haven't listened to Red Hot Chili Peppers a ton since I was in high school, but like many of those other high school bands, they are very good alternative rock. And while this is not really my favorite album of theirs, it is 2 discs and quite long, and there's a fair number of great tracks on it. I don't think I have to say too much about Red Hot Chili Peppers, though. If you're watching this video, chances are you have heard some of their music. And so, next up, we have Burning Bright, Field on Fire by 9 Inch Nails from Not the Actual Events. Now, I will admit I haven't listened to the most recent 9 Inch Nails stuff a lot, so I don't really have much of an opinion on this song, but I'm sure I would like it if I knew it better, just like most of their stuff. So that's that. Next up is Rental Car by Beck off the album Huero. And continuing the streak in this video of bands I listened to a lot of in high school, Beck is one of those. And though I don't like everything he's put out, he's got a good variety of alternative rock that I'm sure you've probably heard 2000s alternative rock, I would recommend Beck. Next up is Coinop Bop by Christopher Madigan off the Cuphead soundtrack. Now, those of you familiar with my channel in the last couple years should know that I was a big fan of Cuphead, and I think part of what made that game so great was the soundtrack. It's got a very nostalgic feel to it. It's a bunch of jazzy big band music. It's very fun and even at times relaxing, and it really, really fits the old school 1930s mood of the game. Enough so that I enjoy listening to it outside of the game's context sometimes, so I had to add this to my library. But there's not much else to really say about it. You know what you're getting into if you're familiar with Cuphead, and if not, you may enjoy it if you like 1930s style big band music. And so next up, it is Point of Demarcation by At the Drive-In off the album Diamante. And At the Drive-In is definitely one of my favorite bands of all time, slightly below the Mars Volta. Now, why am I mentioning the Mars Volta, you ask? Because At the Drive-In was the band, or is now, but at one point was the band, that half of, or at least two members, broke off of At the Drive-In to become the Mars Volta, or to form the Mars Volta. And eventually, when the Mars Volta disbanded, At the Drive-In got back together, but the Mars Volta and At the Drive-In are kind of like two sides of the same coin. The Mars Volta, probably one of my favorite bands of all time, is very much progressive rock, kind of Latin experimental, jazz infused. Like, it's really hard to describe them, but they are fantastic at what they do, or were. And At the Drive-In, you can tell is by the same people, but it's more of a hardcore punk band, with some branching off into other territories. But I thought this EP was quite good, though it's not my favorite stuff by them. My favorite album by At the Drive-In would have to be Relationship of Command. But that said, I like pretty much everything they've done. So let's do 3 more songs. The next one is Overcome by All That Remains. And I haven't listened to a ton of All That Remains, but I remember really enjoying the song This Calling back in, I think it was either late high school or early college. And so I did get this album back then. I don't really remember what this song sounds like, but if you like heavy metal, you may enjoy it. That's really all I have to say about it, though. And next up is The Royal We by Silver Sun Pickups off the album Swoon. Silver Sun Pickups is a band that I haven't really listened to their recent stuff, but their first 2 albums, especially their first one, I really, really enjoyed, as well as their first EP. But this album, while it was kind of a hit or miss for me, this is probably one of my favorite songs off of it. It's kind of a harder alternative rock song with grand violins and kind of orchestral elements to it to make it sound a lot more dramatic. And though I feel like it doesn't always work on this album, I think it works very well on this song. And so you may be familiar with the songs by Silver Sun Pickups, such as Lazy Eye. And if you like alternative rock and want to try something with kind of a more orchestral feel to it, I would recommend this album, and specifically this song. And let's do one last song here, and that is Of Reality, Palingenesis by Tesseract, off the album Altered State. Now, Tesseract is a band where I don't really like everything they've done, but this album is spectacular. It is a progressive metal album with a few different styles incorporated at times, but it's mostly straightforward progressive metal. It may be classified as gent, if anyone is familiar with that term. But I assume if you know that term, you know the band Tesseract. And though this is not one of my favorite songs off of it, this album as a whole, especially if you listen to it all the way through, is just incredible musicianship. And so I would highly recommend it if you're into progressive metal. You may even like it if you're not into it. There's not too much screaming if you're not a fan of screaming. It's mostly soft singing. Well, I'd say clean singing, not soft singing, but you get the idea. But Altered State is a great album. So thank you all for watching this video, and I do hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you're feeling more relaxed or even asleep right now. I will see you next time. Have a good night.